textile industry in my constituency of Leicester South. As English is not their first language and all potential employers not having the capacity or the time to meet the DWP's demands for a written proof of job application and interviews, they're finding it extremely stressful and affecting their mental health, especially when threatened with sanctions. Does the Minister agree with me that more empathy is needed to be built into the system?
I thank the honourable gentleman. He's raised an important point, and I will ensure that he has a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss it.
Show Secretary of State Clerk continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State said that background should be no barrier to success. But what message does it send to our young people when they're told there are some job opportunities they cannot apply to solely based on the colour of their skin? Equality in this country must mean equality of opportunity, not putting some people in society on a pedestal above others. So will the Minister write to all public bodies to make it crystal clear that the state should not be sanctioning race-based hiring policies?
She will be aware that it is illegal to discriminate in the way that she has described, and I will certainly ensure that that the question she has raised will be followed up with my relevant colleagues.
Those in writing, we come to topicals.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this month, the government set out our plan for change, a plan to raise living standards for everyone. Everyone should have access to warm homes, a revitalised NHS, opportunities to thrive at work and to feel safe on our streets. And I am proud to be driving our mission to ensure that background is no barrier to success and that every child has the best start in life. This week marks the end of Disability History Month, during which my right honourable friend, the Minister for Disability, has met with disabled people and disabled people's organisations and set up a network of lead ministers for disability across every government department.
Those in writing.
Last week, I visited Northamptonshire Domestic Abuse Services. We discussed, as Domestic Abuse UK estimates, that reported incidents spike up to 20% during the Christmas period. Can the Minister tell me what the government is doing to ensure that those affected by domestic violence can get support at this time of year?
Can I thank my honourable friend for that important question and pay tribute to the work of Northamptonshire Domestic Abuse Services and everyone working across domestic violence and sexual abuse services this Christmas. I know from my own experience working in such services over this Christmas period how busy it can be. But I want to send a message to all victims that support is always there when you need it, even at Christmas, and the police will always respond where they are called, where there are serious concerns. People should know that they are not alone at Christmas, Mr. Speaker, and that help and support is always available.
Show Secretary of State Clerk continue.
Mr. Speaker, turning a blind eye to the risks of vulnerable people in the name of inclusivity is anything but compassionate. We know that cousin marriage significantly increases the risk of childbirth defects and locks women into coercive relationships. The Right Honourable Member for Basildon and Billericay brought forward sensible legislation to ban this practice. Why won't the government support it?
Mr. Speaker, the government will of course always keep such issues under review, and I'll make sure the Minister in the relevant department speaks with the Right Honourable Lady on this topic.
Absolutely. Big picture.
Mr. Speaker, please. Merry Christmas. Recently I attended an RNIB event highlighting challenges faced by blind and visually impaired people navigating past parked cars, forcing them to walk into the road. My inspirational wife is one of those people who takes her life into her own hands every time she walks into the road. Can I ask what the government will do to help make our streets safer and make them more navigable in the future?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a good example of the kind of topic that we need to work across government on, and I was pleased to chair the first meeting of the cross-government disability lead ministers yesterday. The Department of Transport has consulted on the problem that he's raised, which can be very serious for people with a sight impairment, and the Department is considering the options for tackling the problem, and I very much hope that he'll let me know what he finds out in his walk round the constituency shortly.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always nice to get a cheer, Mr. Speaker. As a former treasurer of the Oxford Union, I was disgusted that 3 weeks ago there was a debate that descended into a mess of anti-Semitism, where the students voted in a majority that they would not have reported Hamas's plans if they'd known them prior to the 7th of October attacks. Will the Secretary of State write to the Oxford Union and say that anti-Semitism has no place in our society, and especially not our universities?
The government could not have been clearer in terms of our position on anti-Semitism. There is no place for anti-Semitism in our society, nor for any form of racism. That applies whether it's within educational settings in any other part of our society. That's been made very clear indeed. Thank you.
That completes questions. We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Chris Hinchcliffe.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday I met the brave men and women serving on HMS Iron Duke and the troops serving in Operation Kabaret in Estonia. This Christmas, as every Christmas, members of our armed forces will be serving overseas, working day and night to protect Britain's national security. And I know that the whole House will join me in sending our deepest thanks to them, to our emergency services and everyone working to keep the country safe over the festive period. Mr. Speaker, may I also take this opportunity at the end of the year to thank you and the House staff for all your hard work this year. And can I wish everyone across the House a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Chris Hinchcliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks. In 2021, Kerry and Francis Menai-Davis, who live in my constituency of North East Hertfordshire and are in the gallery here today, tragically lost their son Hugh at the age of just 6 to a rare form of cancer. Now they are courageously campaigning to ensure that every parent who must leave work to look after a sick child in hospital gets the financial support that they need from day one. Will the Prime Minister meet with them and me to discuss implementing Hugh's law and giving their son a legacy that improves the lives of families at the most difficult time imaginable?
Mr. Speaker, can I pay tribute to Kerry and Francis? It is a heartbreaking case and commend them for their campaign on behalf of other families. I know the Minister for Social Security and Disability met the family yesterday, but no parent should endure losing their child to cancer, particularly at such a young age. We are investing £1.5 billion for new surgical hubs and scanners, £70 million for new radiotherapy machines, and we will set out our next steps on the Children and Young People Cancer Task Force shortly.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, can I send my warmest wishes to our armed forces at home and overseas, to the emergency services and everyone who will be working over Christmas. And can I wish you, Mr. Speaker, the House staff and all members of this House a very Merry Christmas. Mr. Speaker, for years, the Prime Minister and his cabinet played politics with the WASPy women. The Deputy Prime Minister said Conservatives were stealing their pensions. She promised to compensate them in full. Another broken promise. Now they admit we were right all along. But let's ask about another group of pensioners whose trust... Let's ask about another group of pensioners whose trust was broken. Since the Chancellor cut winter fuel payments, how many extra people have applied for pension credit?
Mr. Speaker, the number one job of this government was to put the finances back in order after the last government lost control. They left a £22 billion black hole and we had to take tough choices. We made sure the most vulnerable pensioners do get the winter fuel payment, and we have been encouraging and driving up eligibility for pension credit, so saying up to their entitlement. And she should join that campaign. But, Mr. Speaker, here's the difference. Because we've stabilised the economy, we can commit to the triple lock. That means that next April, pensioners get another £470. But here's the difference, because 2 weeks ago, the Shadow Chancellor said the triple lock is unsustainable. Their position,
So pensioners would lose out under the Tories yet again.
Mr. Speaker, he didn't answer the question because he doesn't know the answer. There are 850,000 eligible pensioners not claiming pension credit. If they sign up, that will cost the Treasury £2.3 billion, wiping out the savings that the Chancellor claimed she would make. Before the election, his Chief Secretary told the public they had no plans to cut winter fuel. But they did have plans, didn't they? Age UK say cutting the winter fuel payment with very little notice will potentially jeopardise the health and finances of millions of older people. Does he agree with Age UK that this is the last thing both pensioners and the NHS need?
Mr. Speaker, we've been driving up with a campaign for pension credit. It's important that everybody who's entitled to it claims that pension credit. And she shouldn't claim as some great victory the record of their government that people haven't signed up. We're the ones with the campaign. They should be supporting it. But because of the triple lock, pensions will be going up by £470 next April. She hasn't answered the question. Her shadow chancellor says the triple lock is unsustainable. So she needs to explain how pensioners will be worse off under a Tory government.
It is Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, we protected the triple lock during all our time in government. Meanwhile, energy bills are increasing, despite his promise to cut them by £300. In Scotland, his party leader wants to restore the winter fuel payments. Across England, councils are scrabbling together funds for struggling pensioners. The tragic reality this Christmas is pensioners will suffer and may even die as a result of this cruel policy. Did the Chancellor consider the impact on councils and on the NHS, or does she just not know what she's doing?
The Household Support Fund was set out in the budget. She knows that. We're pushing up pension credit. But she now says they are committed to the triple lock. Her shadow chancellor says they're not, that it's unsustainable. Maybe over a sandwich or a steak they could sort it out and come back and tell us what their policy actually is.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister needs to misrepresent me to make his point. I don't need to misrepresent him to make my point. Yes. The truth is, he didn't think this through. Cutting winter fuel payments isn't just callous. It may not make savings. It could actually cost us all more. And that's not the only policy which is making things worse. The Chancellor's budget is a body blow to family businesses and also charities. Marie Curie have warned that Labour's budget will cost them nearly £3 million a year. This is a cancer charity saying they have no option but to reduce services. Did the Chancellor tell the Prime Minister that her jobs tax was going to hit charities?
Mr. Speaker, she's asked 3 questions about winter fuel with her leaving out. I'll come to that. But she's changed her mind on this. She used to say that the payments were a dead weight. She said there were members of her constituency who didn't need it. They all stood in 2017 on a manifesto, a Tory manifesto, that committed to getting rid of the universal winter payments for pensioners. So we can see what their real commitment is. As for the budget, we're driving up productivity.
I don't want to have to ring your mother. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're driving up productivity, prosperity and living standards. That's a pay rise for the 3 million who are the lowest paid. They should welcome that. A pay rise for those working in the NHS and better than expected wage growth just before Christmas. What unites all three? Delivered by Labour, opposed by the Tories.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know what world he's living in. The economy is shrinking, and they did not think this jobs tax through or who it would impact. Another area affected is the hospice sector. Hospices believe the budget will cost them an extra £30 million. Yesterday, Conservatives voted to exempt social care, nurseries, charities and hospices from their jobs tax. Labour voted this down. So can the Prime Minister at least agree to fund hospices so they can continue their invaluable work helping people at the end of their lives?
Mr. Speaker, we put a record amount into the NHS in the budget to deal with the problem that they left, and we'll set out the funding arrangements for hospices in the new year. But it's the same old, same old. They want all the benefits. She said to herself she wants all the benefits from the budget, but she doesn't want to pay for any of them. That's what got us into the problem in the first place.
Mr. Speaker, I did not hear a commitment there to help hospices, which is a shame. The truth is, this winter, people will be suffering because of his choices. The economy is shrinking, inflation is going up, and jobs are being lost because of his budget. Pensioners won't be able to heat their homes because of his government's decisions. They raised people's hopes but then smashed them with broken promises. And now we learn that he is about to give away our hard-won Brexit freedoms. Mr. Speaker. All right. Mr. Speaker, now we learn he is about to give away our hard-won Brexit freedoms. The truth is, they are punching the British people in the face, literally in the case of one of his MPs, and he will pretend that this is about the past. But we all know these are his choices, bad choices. If he's looking for a New Year's resolution, why doesn't he start with telling the truth?
I'll do it now. £22 billion black hole left by them. Record numbers on the waiting list. Nearly.
It's not a good time to leave the chamber, is it? Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, £22 billion black hole. Record waiting list with our NHS. They should hang their heads in shame. Immigration completely out of control. Nearly 1 million net migration. She was the cheerleader for all of that. She wants the truth. That's the truth. That's why they're sitting there. Mr. Speaker, whilst they cart from the sidelines, talking the country down, this government is getting on with the job. Record funding for the NHS. Money for our trains, buses, and yes, Mr. Speaker, potholes. Pay rises for 3 million of the lowest paid. Wages growing faster than inflation. Planning laws reform. Great British Energy set up. We're only getting started. Next year we'll continue to rebuild, no matter what the blockers opposite say.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I echo the words of the Prime Minister and thank you and all of our staff in this place alongside our armed forces and our emergency services and wish them a Merry Christmas. Mr. Speaker, March 2025 marks 20 years since the death of the only Member of Parliament to have held all four great offices of state: the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, James Callaghan was a true Portsmouth great and went to the same school as another true Portsmouth great, my dad, Terry Nolan. Does the Prime Minister back my bid for a plaque to be added to his former home in Copner, and will he come along to Portsmouth next year to unveil it?
Well, I thank her for her question. Jim Callaghan was a giant of the Labour movement and a great public servant. Mr. Speaker, he left school at 17, served in our Royal Navy before becoming the Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, Chancellor and, of course, finally Prime Minister. And as a proud son of Portsmouth, I'm sure he'd be honoured to be remembered in such a way. Happy Christmas.
Can I just say to Mr. Mayhew, I keep hearing, I heard you the other week over here, I'm hearing again that it's not a good time to push your luck today. Right. Let us come to Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Red David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his praise and best wishes for our armed forces and our emergency services? And can I join others in wishing you happy Christmas, Mr. Speaker, and all the staff of the Commons, and indeed everyone across this House. I'm coming to sing in a minute. Mr. Speaker, I've had the great joy of spending time recently with some amazing young people from the Bath Philharmonia Young Carers Choir. They're a brilliant example of the power of music to make a difference in young people's lives. One member of the choir, Caitlin, has even developed a special new project to spread the joy of music to young people in our schools and communities. So will the Prime Minister meet Caitlin to hear more about her exciting project and work with us and others to support music in our schools and communities?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome his comments, and as you will know, today we're introducing the landmark Children's Wellbeing Bill to enable all children to succeed, including young carers. That increased the pupil funding premium to over £2.9 billion, which can be used to support pupils with identified needs, and that, of course, includes carers. And now young carers are on the school census, as he knows, that's since 2023. They have greater visibility and schools will be better able to identify and support them. Mr. Speaker, he talks of singing. There was carols outside our front door on Monday, and my family was surprised to see the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, shamelessly plugging his song. We have strict rules about antisocial behaviour, but in the spirit of the season, I simply say Happy Christmas.
Sir Red David. Well, Happy Christmas, Prime Minister. Can I thank him for allowing the Young Carers Choir to sing outside number 10? I hope he and the staff enjoyed it. Our song is called Love Is Enough, but the hard truth is, for many young carers and young adult carers, actually love is not enough. These amazing young people need real action to help them with the challenges they face. So in addition to the measures that the Prime Minister just talked about, will he support the Carers Trust's Young Carers Covenant to make sure across government, across local authorities, we are supporting these young people with all the support they deserve?
We should support these young people, and we continue to work across the sector to ensure all schools identify, support and record data on young carers. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we boosted the carers allowance in the budget, but I agree with him in relation to these young carers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister in wishing everyone a very happy Christmas this year? For many in my constituency and indeed across the country, particularly those in temporary accommodation, it won't be a happy Christmas. On the Tories' watch, temporary homelessness more than doubled. So what is the government doing to support families and children living in temporary accommodation, particularly this season?
Well, she's right about the appalling inheritance, which included record numbers sleeping rough, almost 160,000 children living in temporary accommodation. Speaker, we're delivering nearly £1 billion into councils to tackle homelessness, including increasing funding in Bolton over the next year. That includes dedicated support with housing, with mental health, and with employment. But we're also committed to tackling the root causes, and that's why we're building 1.5 million new homes and abolishing Section 21 no-fault eviction, something they said they were going to do and repeatedly failed to do.
Ben Lake. In 2022, the Prime Minister supported calls for fair and fast compensation for 1950s women impacted by the changes to the state pension. And yet, just yesterday, his government rejected those same calls out of hand. Mr. Speaker, is this what the Prime Minister meant when he promised to lead a government of change?
Mr. Speaker, this is a serious issue. Between 2005 and 2007, there were, I think, a 28-month delay in letters to women born in the 1950s about changes to pension age. That was unacceptable, and it was right that the government apologised for that. In 2011, the former Chancellor, George Osborne, then accelerated those changes with very little notice. That equally was unacceptable, and Labour opposed it at the time. It is a serious issue. It's a complex issue. The research, as he knows, shows that 90% of those impacted knew about the changes that were taking place. And I'm afraid to say the taxpayer simply can't afford the tens of billions of pounds in compensation when the evidence does show that 90% of those impacted did know about it. That's because of the state of our economy.
Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent data shows that almost 11,000 Scots have been waiting for hospital treatment for over 2 years after referral. The equivalent number in England is around 113. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that this shows the catastrophic damage the SNP government have done to the Scottish NHS?
Well, he's right when he says the SNP is letting down patients in Scotland. As the Scottish Auditor General says, greater leadership is needed in the Scottish NHS. Waiting list targets are being missed. Spending on agency staff is skyrocketing. And delays to patient discharge are hitting record levels. They seem to be proud of that appalling record. We've provided the money, they've got the powers, they've run out of excuses.
Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the summer, thousands of commuters using Harlington and Flitwick stations have had to put up with nearly 8% of trains being cancelled in the evening peak, and nearly a third of trains that do arrive are more than 5 minutes late. Is it a mere coincidence, Mr. Speaker, that such poor performance follows this government's decision to pay off their union backers with no strings attached?
The trains and all travel was in an appalling state under the last government. We're clearing that up and fixing it, and he should be welcoming that.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Parliamentary Ombudsman concluded that an injustice was done to 1950s born women. It ruled that they are owed compensation and asked Parliament intervened to deliver justice. In my constituency of Liverpool, West Derby, I have more than 5,000 women affected. And alongside a great many members in this House, I believe these women are owed compensation for the injustice done to them at the hands of the state. So will the Prime Minister give members the opportunity to vote on whether they believe WASPy women are owed compensation?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've just set out the factual background and the percentage that knew about the change. And the simple fact of the matter is, in the current economic circumstances, the taxpayer can't bear the burden of tens of billions of pounds in compensation. Well, they're chuntering away. In 14 years, they accelerated the changes and not once spoke about compensation.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents, Caroline and Savannah, are just two of thousands across Devon, Cornwall and beyond who are living with postural tachycardia syndrome and have been unable to access adequate treatment since the retirement of the only consultant available to work with them in July. What action can the Prime Minister take to help me secure the treatment that my constituents need, and will he agree to meet with me and them to discuss the treatment of POTS in more detail?
Well, I thank her for raising this important issue on behalf of her constituents. It does underline the critical importance of the NHS workforce plan that we will deliver next summer to ensure that the export workforce is in place to get the NHS back on its feet. I am proud that we're investing an additional £22.6 billion to fix our NHS, and I will, of course, make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to deal with the issues of concern to her constituents.
Jodie Gosling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and a very Merry Christmas. May I associate myself with the comments of the Prime Minister and my gratitude to all of those that serve our communities over Christmas. I'd like to give special credit to foster carers in Nuneaton and across the UK for the incredibly important role that they play. We know that their care transforms lives, but the foster carers in Nuneaton tell me that there simply isn't the support that there used to be, and over 17% of children are waiting over 4 years for care. Recently, I was made aware of one child who had had 9 home placements before the end of Key Stage 1. Can the Prime Minister ensure that there will be a robust system to provide consistent and swift care when needed?
Well, I'm grateful to her for raising this issue because, Mr. Speaker, every single child deserves the best start in life, and there are far too many shocking cases of children being let down. The Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill is being introduced today, and that does put children's interests at the heart of government policy, and I hope it will be supported across the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour promised not to raise taxes on working people, but farmers are some of the hardest working people that I know. Peter Douglas from Jedburgh has looked at the details of this policy, and he says Labour's inheritance tax increase will prevent him passing on his family farm to his son and daughter. They say Labour have betrayed them. They can't trust the Prime Minister to keep his words. They've got a point, haven't they?
If he would kindly pass the details of the individual case he's raised to my team, we will look into it. As he knows, we put a record £5 billion into farming over the next 2 years in the budget. Just 2 weeks ago, £350 million was put in to support farmers. That contrasts with the £300 million underspend of the last government on farming. And in a typical case, the threshold is £3 million, which means that the vast majority of farmers will be unaffected. But I'll look into the individual case that he's raised with me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently spoke to a man in Worksop whose son's arm was badly broken when he was knocked off his bicycle by an off-road biker speeding on the pavement. Dressed in black, no number plate, totally unidentifiable. The young boy no longer goes out to play. His experience isn't unique. What action is being taken to smash the bikes and put police back on our streets?
Well, I'm glad she's raised this, because off-road bikes were a complete nuisance under the last government, got completely out of control. We're introducing new respect orders to crack down on off-road bikes, strengthening police powers in relation to dealing with this big problem that got out of control under the last government. We will also deliver 13,000 more neighbourhood police to ensure that we keep control of our streets, something that was lost under the last government.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead announced plans to hike council tax by an unprecedented 25%. This would require the government's permission. Does he agree with me that this outrageous request should be rejected, that the borough might be a candidate for accelerated local government reorganisation, and my constituents should not be footing the bill for the persistent weak financial control and political failure locally?
Well, thank you for raising this issue on behalf of his constituents. We are, as he knows, committed to fixing the foundations of local government and keeping taxes as low as possible for working people. The budget announced real terms increase for local government with over £4 billion of added funding. And so we will put that support in place, and he's right to raise this issue.
Speaker, please, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have in our NHS many brilliant emigre and refugee surgeons from the greatly troubled Middle East. And I've been privileged to work alongside some of them, Iran, Iraq, and now, as we think, especially of Syria. What practical measures can the UK take to help ensure that Syria now has the best chance of becoming an open society and the second functional democracy in the region?
Well, I thank you for drawing attention to the people of Syria and to the health workers of all backgrounds who do vital work in our NHS. The fall of Assad's brutal regime is to be welcomed and should be welcomed, but we must be cautious about what comes next. We've provided £50 million of extra support to vulnerable Syrians, and I've spoken to G7 leaders to work towards a Syrian government that respects international law, universal human rights, and protects all citizens across all sectors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dave Dugan.
Mr. Speaker, before the election, this Prime Minister said he would lower energy bills by £300. Since he took office, they've gone up by £149. He said he would protect the winter fuel payment, but now he's in power, he's stripped it off our pensioners. And he said he lined up for many photos with waspy women, saying he'd have their backs, and he's just betrayed them in the most scandalous way possible. This is now the defining characteristic of this one-trick phony Prime Minister who says one thing and does another. In Scotland, the SNP are 16 points ahead in the polls. Does he understand Does he understand why the people of these islands, especially those of us in Scotland, treat him with such contempt?
They used to ask those questions. They used to ask those questions from this sort of area with very many MPs not so long ago. That all changed in July, and he's now carping from right up there. We can hardly hear him.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry I couldn't hear you over the hubbub. First of all, can I wish you a very Merry Christmas, and all colleagues across the House a very Merry Christmas, and especially the House staff. And also, I associate myself with the remarks thanking emergency services and our armed forces for their service. Mr. Speaker, Christmas is a time for peace and goodwill. Given there are more conflicts now than at any time since World War II, and that all wars end with a peace, what is the Prime Minister's resolution to work with others for a more peaceful world in 2025?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank her for her question? And I'm sure colleagues across the House support the values of the Parliamentarians for Peace, which I know she is involved with, and their work to support human rights across the globe. And that is the sentiment, I think, that we take into this festive period. Thank you.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it was good to hear that the Prime Minister visited British soldiers in Estonia yesterday before they have to spend Christmas away from their families. We would all like to see a lasting peace emerge for Ukraine in the new year, but Putin may take any deal brokered by Trump as a break in which to re-equip and rearm. What will his government do to deter Russia from restarting its imperial war of aggression following any peace deal?
Well, can I congratulate him on his appointment to the Intelligence and Security Committee and thank him for raising the question of our troops in Estonia who will be there over Christmas without their families, and they're right on the front line with a very clear sense of purpose as part of our NATO contingent, and we thank them. He's right that we must continue to support Ukraine, and that was the subject of our discussions in Estonia yesterday, and make sure Ukraine is put in the strongest possible position, whether negotiations or not, and be absolutely clear that this conflict could be ended straight away if the aggressor, Russia, backed off.
Mother of the House, Diane Abbott.
The WASPy women fought one of the most sustained and passionate campaigns for justice that I can remember, year in, year out. We did promise them that we would give them justice. I understand the issue about the cost, but does the Prime Minister really understand how let down WASPy women feel today?
I do understand the concern, of course I do. I set out the history, Mr. Speaker, but the research is clear that 90% of those impacted did know about the change. And in those circumstances, the taxpayer simply can't afford the burden of tens of billions of pounds of compensation. But I do understand the concerns.
Will Forster.
I know the Prime Minister is aware of the case of my constituent, Zara Sharif, who was brutally tortured and appallingly murdered by her father and her stepmother. I want Zara's legacy to be one where she's the last vulnerable child to be killed by people that should have looked after her. Will the Prime Minister ensure that an independent inquest and review is taken into Zara's death and it's held immediately in the new year so we can learn why public authorities failed, so we can ensure that it never happens again?
He rightly raises this absolutely harrowing case, and it is important that all the lessons are learned. There is an independent process going on, but we must be clear about overhauling children's social care to keep young people safe and looking again about the framework for homeschooling, amongst other things. So we need to learn those lessons. We are taking steps. There is a process going on at the moment, and I'll update the House in due course.
Alan Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for the leadership he has shown in securing the £500 million deal to secure the future of the Hitachi rail factory in my constituency. A factory left in the lurch by the party opposite for years. And does he agree? Will he agree with me that what we also need is a long-term plan for our proud high-tech rail manufacturing to drag it out of the mire it was left in by the Tories?
Thank you for that question. They really shouldn't groan. I went up to the Hitachi factory earlier this year before the election. The workforce were extremely anxious about the situation because they feared that there would be a gap between contracts. This is a gap that might mean people aren't going to get laid off, and he's chuntering from a sitting position, unable to understand the impact on working people. Mr. Speaker, the workforce were extremely anxious about the situation when I saw them, because they knew if their colleagues were laid off, then that would be bad for their colleagues in their community, and it would mean that they might go and get other jobs and not be able to come back if there was a new contract. I said then that I would do everything I could to ensure that we filled that gap, and I'm very pleased that just the other week we were able to say that there's a contract, and I went back up there to speak to the same workforce, and I can say they were very pleased that they don't now have those anxieties. They should be ashamed of their chuntering.
Final question, Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As it's Christmas, will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating Chris Middleton, who wrote a charity song to support Age UK, which has already raised £10,000? What's even better is it's likely to beat the leader of the Lib Dems and his single to #1 this year, proving yet again that the Lib Dems can't win. Something I hope we can both agree on.
I'm not going to adjudicate between the contending singles for the top of the charts, but I will end, Mr. Speaker, this is the last question, I think, by just repeating a happy Christmas and a peaceful New Year to everyone across the House.
Right, we'll let the front benches change up. We now come to the urgent question. Dame Priti Patel.
To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Development Affairs if he'll provide an update on the negotiations between His Majesty's Government and the Government of Mauritius over the future sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her question. We welcome yesterday's reiteration, Mr. Speaker, by Prime Minister Ramgoolam of his willingness to conclude a deal with the UK. We are confident that the agreement is in both sides' shared interests, and we will continue working with the new Mauritian government to finalise the deal. Prime Minister Ramgoolam's comments follow his commitment to completing the negotiations following his election in an exchange of letters with the Prime Minister. And as part of the usual government-to-government engagement, the Prime Minister's Biot envoy, Jonathan Powell, met with PM Ramgoolam in late November to start that process. And this was followed last week, Mr. Speaker, by a visit to Mauritius by the UK's chief negotiator, Harriet Matthews, and other officials for the talks. These talks were productive, and it's now completely understandable that the new Mauritian government will want time to study the details. It would not be appropriate, Mr. Speaker, or usual for me to give a running commentary on what was discussed during routine and private engagements, nor indeed on any potential future engagements. However, I am confident that we have agreed a good and fair deal that is in both sides' interests. It protects the base at proportionate cost. It has been supported across the national security architecture in the United States and by India for those very reasons. There will be clear commitments, as I've said a number of times in this House, Mr. Speaker, in the treaty for robust security arrangements, including preventing the presence of foreign security forces on the outer islands, ensuring that the base can continue to operate securely and effectively. The agreement is subject to finalising a treaty, and following signature, the Government will bring forward a bill to enable implementation of that treaty, and both Houses of Parliament will also have the opportunity to scrutinise that treaty before ratification.
Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for granting this urgent question. And once again, ministers have been reluctantly dragged to the House, and I've just seen the Foreign Secretary leg it from the House, in fact. In a world of increasing danger and change and uncertainty, why are they so keen to surrender this strategic asset? We've been told, Mr. Speaker, repeatedly by ministers that this is a good deal, that it has the support of the national security apparatus. We keep hearing this. Where is the evidence to justify these hollow complaints? And if the deal is so good, why has the government been so secretive about the details? So can the minister explain? I'm just so sorry the Foreign Secretary has just abandoned the House and not even come here, because yet again we are responding to media reports. Will the minister be able to extend the lease on the military base after 99 years, as reported? Will we and the US still have full autonomy of operation? What safeguards will be in place to stop other countries, including China, from potentially trying to establish themselves on the base or near the military base on Diego Garcia? How much is the British taxpayer going to be liable for each year, and in total over 99 years? Now that we know we'll be paying for the privilege of giving away these islands, what exactly is our money going to be paying for? And the government claims it cannot disclose this information about the lease, but he can at least surely say and explain and be honest, where on earth is this budget coming from? If it's accounted for in the budget forecast presented in the autumn, and we've all heard about those budget forecasts recently, tell us what the funding is going to be for the economic partnership and the trust fund for Chagosian people. Can the minister also tell us what aspects of this deal the new Mauritian government want reconsidering in the response? What consideration is being given to provide more funding or to weaken any protections that maybe, has it been, the views of the Chagosian community have been so ignored? And Mr. Speaker, when the whole world can see that this proposed deal was falling apart, the Foreign Secretary and this government have tried to flog it constantly. Not only is this monumental failure of statecraft from this Labour government, it is also a significant humiliation for the Foreign Secretary and his credibility and the Prime Minister. And why are Labour putting the security at risk, ignoring Chagosians and letting our stand-in go into free fall in this world?
Just to remind people, it is 2 minutes.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're absolutely not damaging our security, we're protecting it through this deal. And that is why this deal has been agreed, to protect the operation of that base, to protect it against the legal uncertainty, and to ensure that it is on a safe footing well into the next century. Now, Mr. Speaker, she constantly refers to somehow as giving up the base on Diego Garcia. This is exactly the opposite. It protects the base on Diego Garcia. It protects the base to continue operating.
Mr. Gaddy, we had enough all the way through PMQs. If I hear any more, you're out, and I seriously mean that. I'm constantly not putting up with it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, she constantly refers as if somehow we're giving up the base on Diego Garcia. That is the exact opposite of what this deal does. Unlike the failure to secure that deal under the previous administration, which I might remind the House, Mr. Speaker, went through 11 rounds of negotiations and failed to secure a deal to protect our base. So it protects the base. Mr. Speaker, she asked a series of other questions. She asked me, would we be able to extend the lease? The answer is yes. Would we continue to have the autonomy of our operations for those in our allies? Absolutely yes. Are there safeguards in place to prevent foreign forces or others on the outer islands? Absolutely yes. I have answered the questions on costs a number of times in the House. We are very clear. We are very clear that it is not normal practice for the United Kingdom to confirm the value of its payments for military bases anywhere across the globe. We have not done, Mr. Speaker, in the case of any other base, for example, that in Oman. And the United States itself has not confirmed the value of its direct payments for bases, including in Djibouti and the Marshall Islands. She spoke about the Chagossians. I am confident, having engaged with Chagossian communities over many years, that this deal has clear benefits for Chagossian communities. It will allow resettlement of the outer islands. It will allow the restart of visits. There is the trust fund that she mentioned herself. And it's only clear, Mr. Speaker, she referred to media reports. There is a huge amount of speculation. Let's get back to the actual facts on this, Mr. Speaker, which is that Mauritius, the Prime Minister has confirmed himself in Mauritius to his Assembly that he is willing to conclude this deal with the United Kingdom. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker, and we will protect our national security and our interests.
Peter Lunn.
Under the Mauritian Criminal Code, someone who questions the integrity of Mauritian territories, including the Chagos Archipelago, is subject to potentially 10 years of imprisonment. Most British Chagossians have at one time or another effectively given that level of disconsideration to the Mauritian government. What conversations have taken place by the Minister with the Mauritian government to ensure that this code will be removed so that it is possible for British Chagossians to visit Chagos in the event that this deal goes through?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, we take the interests of Chagossian communities incredibly seriously. The deal provides for Chagossians to return to the outer islands and be able to resettle if Mauritius decides to pursue a programme of resettlement. Most importantly, we're going to get on with getting those visits going so that they can go back and visit islands, including Diego Garcia, with the appropriate protections in place.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary told this House on the 7th of October that his deal was in the UK's security interest. Yet the chaos we have seen since then does nothing to assure our allies nor repel our enemies. In retrospect, does the Minister think it was wise to announce an agreement just weeks before elections in Mauritius and in the US? And does he agree it would be wise for any future agreement to come before this House for scrutiny and a vote before signature? It's important that any agreement complies with the opinion of the ICJ, but self-determination remains an important principle too. So now that the negotiations have reopened, can the Minister say how the Chagossian people will be represented in those talks? And the court ruled this week that Tamil asylum seekers were illegally detained on Diego Garcia in terrible conditions. Will the Minister apologise for their treatment and assure the House that the camp in which they were held is now closed for good?
Well, Mr. Speaker, on his first questions about the Chagossians, as I've said repeatedly in this House, their interests have been absolutely at the heart of this deal, and I'm sure they will be confident that there are a number of provisions which will satisfy the concerns that members are raising in good faith across this House and that Chagossians have raised with me directly. This was a treaty negotiation between the United Kingdom and Mauritius. He said he's aware of the ICJ judgment. I let him read that in his own time. He asked specifically about the situation regarding the migrants. Of course, we absolutely recognise and we are carefully considering the judgment of the court this week. But let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, that government inherited a deeply troubling situation which remained unresolved under the last administration for years after the migrants' arrival on Diego Garcia. I believe that the Shadow Foreign Secretary was Home Secretary at the time that the migrants first arrived. This situation went on unresolved. We were absolutely clear that this was an unsustainable situation, and we worked at pace to resolve this situation. We will carefully consider the judgment of the court.
Derek Twig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can say to the Minister, those of us who have spoken to the American military know how important a base this is. Can I just confirm with him what he said? Is that since this was announced, there's been no concern raised with the government by the American military or security services?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, as far as I'm aware, that is the case, and in fact, actually the opposite. There has been a warm welcome for this agreement from across the United States security apparatus because it puts this base and our operations and our shared operations on a secure footing into the future, which, of course, Mr Speaker, I remind the House again, is the very reason that this government and indeed the former Foreign Secretary started this process in the first place, so we are told.
Oh, well, let's go over to James Cleverly then.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I would be very grateful if the Minister were able to answer this with a simple yes or no. Did the Right Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras have any conversations with Philip Sands, KC, about Diego Garcia without the presence of Foreign Office or other government civil servants? Yes or no?
Mr Speaker, I don't have details of all of the Prime Minister's details. I'm sure he can ask the Prime Minister that question himself.
Kelvin Bailey.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For those of us that have served for the US military, that have and retain genuine and close links with the US military and know that this does not bring about the concern that others are trying to conflate around these issues, could I ask for the Minister's view on how this is viewed by our US military friends?
My honourable friend for that question and praise him for his service and work. And I'm very, very clear, our allies in the United States and indeed our other allies who rely on the important guarantees that this base provides are supportive of this deal. This has been supported across the security apparatus at every level, and that is absolutely crucial because we would not have signed up to a deal if it didn't protect our interests and those of our closest ally.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
Can the Minister enlighten us as to the attitude of the incoming Trump administration on the deal? Does he know, or shall I ask the Honourable Member for Clacton?
Well, we very much welcome, as I've said before, Mr Speaker, the election of President-elect Trump and indeed Vice President-elect Vance. We don't, as you know, Mr Speaker, during the transition period, there are restrictions on what conversations can and can't go on. We are, as I've said repeatedly in this House, confident that when the full details of this deal are provided by, indeed, the US national security apparatus, that any concerns will be allayed.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know the Minister is a strong supporter of overseas territories, as is the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister. Despite this being documented already in this House and in Gibraltar, for example, can the Minister, to avoid any doubt or further scaremongering for the benches opposite, once again confirm that this government is completely committed to supporting the right of self-determination for the people of Gibraltar and for the Falklands?
Well, Mr Speaker, I've said it before, and I thank her for her important work on Gibraltar and indeed yours, Mr Speaker, and I will confirm against the House, we are absolutely resolutely committed to the sovereignty and self-determination of Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands, and indeed I enjoyed meeting with our overseas territories family at the Joint Ministerial Council just a few weeks ago.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's truly baffling that such decent ministers have allowed themselves to be bamboozled by the blob. Can the Minister confirm that this is not being rushed through in advance of the takeover of the White House by an incoming president in 1 month's time? And if in 1 month's time that new president says this is a terrible deal, will it be too late to change it?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the right honourable gentleman knows I have immense respect for him and his work in this House, and I do have to take issue with his choice of words. We have incredible officials in this government who've served governments loyally on both sides of this House. They work incredibly hard, and they work incredibly hard to defend the national security and the interests of this country. If anything, Mr Speaker, this wasn't rushed at all. This was 11 rounds of negotiations under his former government. We got in, we got a deal done. We got a deal done that protects our national security and our interests.
Bill Brittle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What assurances can the Minister provide Parliament around the scrutiny that the agreement, which will be struck in due course, receive?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and as I've said a number of times in this House, the treaty, once signed, will go through the normal procedures in the House. I confirmed in my answer to the right honourable lady that it will go through that procedure. It will have opportunity for ample scrutiny by both Houses, and legislation will be laid in due course.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister gets ahead of himself. He says the government has moved at pace to resolve the situation. The situation is not resolved. He criticises the last government for not securing a deal. His deal is not secured either. Last time we talked about this, we talked about the Americans not being, the President-elect not being keen on the deal, the Chagossians not being properly consulted on the deal. When is he going to come back to the House on this situation and tell us something positive about this cack-handed deal?
Minister.
Well, I've repeatedly stated a number of positive things, including the support that will be inherent in this deal for Chagossians. Mr. Speaker, the positive fact is that after 11 rounds of failed negotiations under the previous government, we achieved and have done a deal. And we are confident that that deal will be supported by our partners, and we will continue to present details of it in due course.
Steve Race.
Does the Minister agree that by confirming the legal status of the base, which was left outstanding by the previous government, it will cement our role in the Indo-Pacific and provide an important pillar in our strategy to counter Chinese influence in the area?
Mr. Speaker, he's absolutely right, and despite the attempts to constantly whip up this idea about Chinese influence, this deal contains very specific precautions to prevent foreign forces. And I remind the House again, Mr. Speaker, that Mauritius was one of the only countries that didn't join the Belt and Road Initiative. Their ally is India, not China.
Sir Bernard James.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is clearly wanting to dismantle legacies of empire. So why then do we think it's so important to attach the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, when in fact that link was only established when both territories were acquired by the French Empire and later acquired by the British Empire? Why don't we listen to the Chagossians themselves instead of imposing the legacy of empire on the Chagossians?
Well, I have engaged with many Chagossian groups, and he will know, as I've said multiple times, that there are a range of views across the Chagossian community, and of course he's perfectly able to look at the legal judgments himself. The fact is that this government wanted to secure the long-term operation of this base and our national security and our interests. We've engaged with our partners, and we've secured a deal, which his previous government failed to do.
Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What is clear is that the current situation is clearly unsustainable. Most of the negotiations on this took place under the previous administration. It is now becoming a political football. Has he heard any other serious recommendations for the future of this island?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no, I haven't, and I certainly haven't heard them from the opposite benches.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will repeat the question asked by my honourable friend, which the Minister studiously avoided, which is that clearly this deal was not ready to be signed. So why was it announced 2 weeks before the election?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when we're looking to protect the national security of this country, we will operate at the fastest and most appropriate pace that we can. The fact is that this has been left languishing under the previous administration, with the future of the base unsecure, and we have secured it.
Jim Rocker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I wish you a Merry Christmas as well. Does the Minister recognise that again and again this issue is being raised by the opposition, but the cognitive dissonance of the fact that it was them that opened the negotiations in the first place? And I have to endorse, Mr. Speaker, the comments of my honourable friend about the scaremongering and the irresponsible way the opposition has conducted this debate with regard to other overseas territories and self-determination.
A little bit concerned, as I've granted the UQ. I've taken a judgment call. I hope we're not questioning that, Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, and it's absolutely right that this House scrutinises these matters and will continue to get the opportunity to do so in a range of forums. Indeed, I'm meeting with parliamentarians later today to discuss these matters. But, Mr. Speaker, there does appear to be collective amnesia on the opposite side. I've raised it on a number of times. Many of them served as ministers in the previous government, and they knew exactly what the risks were to our national security.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've just returned hot foot from a very full Mar-a-Lago. And I've spoken to several members, senior administrators especially, of the incoming administration who will be in the White House in 32 days' time. Let me assure you, there is very deep disquiet amongst all of them as to what this may mean for the long-term future of Diego Garcia and whether such deal would hold, given the precedent of the deal break over Hong Kong. They also can't understand why we would surrender the sovereignty of these islands on an advisory judgment from a pretty obscure court. But this is about sovereignty, and you keep saying yourself that the sovereignty...
No, we can't both stand. When you say you mean me. I am having no ownership of this decision.
Right? Fair enough, fair enough. Can we please, if we respect the sovereignty of Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands on the basis it's what the people want, can we have a referendum of all of the eligible Chagosians and let them decide what the future sovereignty of the Chagos Islands is? That surely is the only fair solution.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear that these were negotiations between the United Kingdom and Mauritius, and I've set out in the past the reasons for that. The interests of the Chagosians are absolutely at the heart of this agreement. As I said, I've repeatedly engaged with them. And I do find, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman continues to speculate. With the greatest respect, he does not know the detail of what is agreed. He doesn't know the detail that has been shared. He doesn't know, Mr. Speaker, the detail that the national security apparatus of the United States has considered, and I am confident, Mr. Speaker, that he would have his concerns allayed when he sees the detail of this deal.
Dr. Andrew Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and a Merry Christmas to you. The Minister says that views across the Chagosian community is mixed. In my experience, Mr. Speaker, when politicians say that, they're simply choosing the views they want to hear. Will the Minister therefore take the opportunity that has been given by the incoming Mauritian government to take a breathing space in which he can consult formally and in a structured way with Chagosians to find out what they want?
Mr. Speaker, I've engaged with Chagosian communities twice in recent months, as is made clear in answers to a number of parliamentary questions tabled by colleagues of his. Their interests will continue to be at the heart of this agreement. I take their concerns very seriously. I'm being quite honest, Mr. Speaker, that there are a range of views. There are some who oppose the deal, and there are some who are in favour of it. That's completely natural in a democratic process.
Let's go to a long-term campaigner. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, having been a member of the Chagos Islands Group ever since it was founded and had a lot of interaction with Chagosians over the last 25 years, I can assure him that I've met many Chagosians in this country and in Mauritius. They were abominably treated and shortchanged by the deal of 1968 and then later removed from the islands. Their one unifying cause is the right of return and settlement. And in that, I hope that the Minister will confirm there will be a right of return and settlement, and I understand all the negotiations surrounding the base. There is no reason why that should not include also a right of at least visiting, if not residing, on Diego Garcia itself. The ICJ judgment was very, very clear that the decolonisation process was not properly carried out by Britain in the 1960s when Mauritius achieved its independence, and that has to be righted. That has been voted on by the ICJ, voted on by the General Assembly, endorsed by the Security Council. Is there any more evidence that's necessary to indicate that it is clearly part of Mauritius, and the Chagosians obviously have rights within Mauritius as well as on the Chagos Islands when hopefully they'll be able to return?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with this characterisation of what happened to Chagosians in the past. It's a matter of deep regret for this government, and indeed, I think that regret is shared across the House. As I said, we will have the interest of Chagosians at the heart of this agreement. He is right to characterise the range of views amongst Chagosian communities in response to the question that I just had, and I can confirm to him that the programme of visits will include the ability to visit all of the islands, including Diego Garcia, with the appropriate safeguards in place, and I hope resettlement of the outer islands. That's certainly provision there for that to happen, and I think this is one of the most likely scenarios in which Chagosians can finally return to those outer islands.
Bob Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is trying to say that nothing has changed over this deal. Yet the media reports suggest that the new Prime Minister from Mauritius says the deal's not good enough. And indeed, the Minister is now saying it's the same deal. So clearly there is something that is not being told to this House. Either the amount of money we're paying for the rental of the space is going to have to increase, or alternatively, some terms and conditions have changed. So, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for ensuring that this House can scrutinise this position. The Minister should have given a statement to that effect rather than having to have a UQ. But could we therefore pause this role, allow the Chagossians to have their say, look at what the American government coming in has to say, and then, before we proceed to this giveaway, make sure that everyone is in agreement.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister of Mauritius has made very clear in his exchange of letters with the Prime Minister of this country, and also indeed in his own statement yesterday, that they are willing to conclude an agreement with us. That's very, very clear. So on the fundamentals, nothing has changed. We're engaged in conversations. It's only natural after an election that they would want to do that and be able to scrutinise the agreement. That's entirely proper. That's why officials have been having those conversations. But I'm not, Mr. Speaker, going to give a running commentary on private discussions.
Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the Minister will want to give the House the greatest possible clarity on what has brought us to this point. The Foreign Secretary has been clear that one of the central considerations for the government was the likelihood, if not the inevitability, of a binding legal judgment against the UK in this matter. The Minister will know that the judgments of the International Court of Justice are not binding on the United Kingdom when disputes between the UK and another state which are or were a member of the Commonwealth. That would include Mauritius. I don't expect the Minister to disclose the legal advice the government has received, but will he please give the House some more clarity about the nature of the legal jeopardy that the government perceives here?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not, for that very reason, going to go into that type of advice. He knows from his extensive and distinguished experience on these matters. But I do have to ask a fundamental question, Mr. Speaker. If there wasn't a problem, why did his government start negotiations on this?
Jane Caroline.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I think we can forgive our overseas territories for being a little bit concerned about this government's commitment to their right to self-determination, because those of us like me who are a little bit older and have long memories will very well remember when the Labour government last time round opened negotiations with the Spanish government over the future of Gibraltar. But what I'm more interested in about today is really reassurance from him that any decision is going to be well informed. So can he tell me which of his ministers has visited the British Indian Ocean territories?
Okay. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do have to say, and I like the Honourable Lady, but I do find that the constant way in which the Falklands, Gibraltar and other overseas territories which are not comparable to this situation are brought up is extremely unhelpful. They are very clear to me. I have just been, Mr. Speaker, as you know, with the leaders at the Joint Ministerial Council. You graciously hosted a reception as well. We have been absolutely resolute in our commitments to the Falklands and Gibraltar. I've been there and said it to myself directly on the rock. The Minister for the Armed Forces has just been down in the Falklands saying exactly the same as the Falkland Islanders. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, they are getting fed up with the nonsense that we're hearing, I'm afraid, about this. It's hugely problematic for their interests going forward. So I want to make that absolutely clear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I refer to my entry in the Register of Members' interest? Surely the Minister must accept, though, that the timing of this announcement was one of the biggest diplomatic gaffes of modern times, because it came literally hours before a general election was called. There was a widespread perception in Mauritius that this government was trying to give a leg up to a very, very unpopular sitting government who subsequently scored 0 out of 60 directly elected seats in the Mauritian Parliament. And doesn't he agree that it is wholly appropriate that the new Labour Mauritian government would be wary of the intentions of his government?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I simply don't recognise the characterisation he's made.
Adley Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister update the House on the measures being taken to safeguard against the emergence of Chinese military and surveillance capabilities in British Indian Ocean territory?
Mr. Speaker, I've been very, very clear. There are provisions in the agreement to ensure the security of the outer islands. This deal would not have been agreed by across the United States security apparatus, or indeed by us, were it to give that kind of benefit to another country. So I've been very clear about Mauritius's position in relation to China, and there are provisions and safeguards in place that should allay any fears on that matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister didn't seem to answer the questions raised by the Shadow Foreign Secretary. So could I ask just one more time, from which budget does the government plan to make the annual payments that he is proposing to the Mauritian government?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've been very, very clear. It is not normal practice. I mean, Mr. Speaker, they can guffaw all they like. I'm going to give the answers that relate to the facts here and that relate to the national security and interests of this country. They spent 11 rounds of negotiations, failed to achieve a deal. We achieved that deal. We will provide the further details in due course.
Dr. Neil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yet again, this new Labour government rushed into an ill-judged and regrettable policy decision to cede the British Indian Ocean territory to Mauritius, against expert advice and with no regard to the wishes of the Chagossians in this country and elsewhere. Like their awful policies on scrapping the winter fuel payment for pensioners, the heartless family farm tax and their jobs tax, will the government now show some leadership, admit that they have got this wrong, scrap this deal and keep this vital territory under British control to protect UK interests, the marine environment and ultimately global security in an increasingly unstable and dangerous world?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I might gently suggest to the honourable gentleman that he spends a bit more time reflecting on the failures of his administration on this matter, and indeed on a whole series of other issues ranging from the national public finances and our national security. This government is clearing up the mess not only on this issue but on so many other issues that his government and his party left behind.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his answers? However, I am, along with others, a consignatory to the British Indian Overseas Territories Bill calling for descendants born to individuals within the British Indian Ocean Territories to register as BIOT. There's even some I believe there's an even more imperative because of the Chagos decision, which is made with no input from local people. So my question to the Minister is this: what discussions will take place with those who consider themselves British? It would seem that the Chagosians are not assured, so what will be done to ensure that they have all necessary information in a timely manner and not to get their answers to the questions that they have through news media outlets?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said a number of times, in deep respect for the honourable gentleman, the government's been clear, deeply regrets the way that Chagossians were removed from the islands and the way they were treated thereafter. We've always been clear on respecting the interests of Chagossian communities. As I said, I've engaged and will continue to engage with Chagossian communities. Their interests at the heart of this deal, and whether it's the trust fund, whether it's the ability to resettle, the ability to visit the islands, and indeed a whole series of other measures which we've taken here in the United Kingdom, I'm confident that their interests are being respected.
Right, that completes the urgent question. I'll let we now come to the urgent question. The statement. Minister Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government was elected on a mandate of change to deliver a new era of economic growth and national renewal and reverse the years of failure and decline that we inherited. And through the tough decisions that we took at the budget, we prevented a return to austerity while protecting working people's payslips. The plan for change the Prime Minister unveiled earlier this month is the next stage on the journey of reform, a plan to kickstart growth and get Britain building again, putting more money in people's pockets and delivering 1.5 million new homes, good jobs and opportunities for all. And just this week, we announced our plans to rebuild and reform local government and to empower local leaders to deliver this change so that the benefits are felt in every community. Because we cannot do this alone. We need strong, empowered local government to work with us as equal partners in a new relationship. Public service, our collective duty. But after a decade of cuts, fiscal mismanagement and the failure to fix the foundations by the previous government, it stands as a fact that councils of all political stripes are in crisis. The broken local audit system in England and the scandal of the unacceptable backlog, which led to the recent whole of government's accounts disclaimer, serves to further illustrate the dire straits of a system and the legacy that we must reconcile. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister gets this. As a former director of a critical public service, he knows that reform is vital. And so too does the Deputy Prime Minister, working on the front line as a home care worker, seeing every single day the human impact. And, Mr. Speaker, I am proud to have public service and local government in my blood too, which is why I take the responsibility to lead this government's work to rebuild the sector with the seriousness that it's due and also with the urgency that is required. This work has already begun, and today marks a major milestone in our mission to rebuild local government and to put councils on a firmer financial footing. As we publish the Provisional Local Government Finance Settlement for 25-26 and to launch our consultation on these proposals alongside our consultation on wider funding reform. The autumn budget announced £4 billion of additional funding for local government services, of which £1.3 billion would go through this settlement presented today. But we know that we need to rally. This is why today I am announcing over £700 million of additional grant. This includes over £200 million of extra funding for social care since the policy statement. I can also confirm that the new funding includes £515 million that will be made available at the final settlement to support councils with an increase in employer national insurance contributions. This package at the provisional settlement will enable local government to invest in the vital services that people rely on, making available £69 billion, equivalent to 3.5% real terms increase in council's core spending power when compared to 24-25. And, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that this will increase even further at the final settlement. Today is a start, it's not the end. Taken together, the additional funding made available at this settlement and the budget delivers over £5 billion of new funding for local services over and above local council tax. Alongside this, Mr. Speaker, every authority in England will receive a one-off share of £100 million currently held in the business rate levy account. Now, together, we must ensure that public investment is used for long-term prevention and the reform of local public services, rather than expensive, short-term crisis responses, which we know often have much worsening outcomes. We are determined to end the cycle of failure that we have seen for too long. And we will provide certainty by ensuring that no authority will see a reduction in their core spending power after accounting for council tax flexibilities next year. We are also ensuring that taxpayers' money goes to where it's needed the most. And, Mr. Speaker, this includes an immediate down payment, a highly targeted £600 million recovery grant funded through the repurposing of the Rural Service Delivery Grant and the Services Grant ahead of broader reforms to a fairer funding system later. And today, we are launching a consultation on local authority funding reform starting in 26-27. Now, there will always be tough decisions to make, but we are determined to ensure that we reflect fairly the real drivers of cost, including demand and the need for public services, as well and importantly, as the ability of councils to raise revenue locally. Which is why, Mr. Speaker, we are making up to £3.7 billion of extra funding available through this settlement to help local authorities to meet the spiralling cost of social care. This includes an additional £200 million uplift to the social care grant, which I am confirming today, taking the total increase to this grant for 25-26 to £880 million. This includes the new Children's Social Care Prevention Grant, first announced in the policy statement, which I am today confirming will be uplifted by a further final settlement by £13 million, taking the total to £263 million. This is the first step in our national rollout of transformed family help services, as we double settlement investment in preventative children's social care services to over £500 million next year. And I want to place on record my appreciation and that of the Deputy Prime Minister for the partnership and determination shown by the Treasury and the Education and Health Secretaries, their ministers and their officials. Mr. Speaker, we will not do as the previous government did, to impoverish councils and for those who needed the support the most, to then parade them around for public shaming. That helps no one. We must work together to get councils back on their feet financially. And the principle stands that it is for local authority to decide at what level they set their council tax and to be accountable to local taxpayers. However, we are committed to keeping taxes on working people as low as possible, and we have to strike a balance. So we will maintain the previous government's policy, as set out in the Office of Budget Responsibilities forecast, of setting a 5% council tax referendum principle, made up of a 3% core principle and the 2% principle for adult social care preset. This means that residents will have the final say over increases that go beyond this. Mr Speaker, we have also put in place a framework for 25-26 to support those councils in the most financial difficulty. And similar to the approach taken by the previous government, we will consider requests for bulk referendum principles on a case-by-case basis. Now, we expect the changes outlined today will give the respite needed and, of course, clarity on the direction of travel. But we also know that 14 years have hit hard, and for some, the recovery grant and the other measures will still mean that additional support is required. But we will put taxpayers and the impact on working people at the forefront of our decisions, and we will look carefully at councils' individual circumstances. For instance, how much they currently charge in council tax and the strength for their plans to protect vulnerable people on low incomes. And to recognise the impact of council tax on households across all councils, we are consulting with the sector on changes to payment instalments, which currently allow annual council tax bills to be spread over 10 months to move to a 12-month schedule by right, helping household budgeting and spreading the cost for working people, and also mirroring how most household bills are paid. But ensuring local government can deliver for working people in the long term, Mr Speaker, requires a root and branch reform of the way that councils are funded, which is why, through the 26-27 settlement, the first multi-year settlement in 10 years, we will introduce an up-to-date assessment of councils' needs and resources. So today, Mr Speaker, we are launching a consultation on the objectives and the principles of those changes. We will consider representation from all corners of the sector to develop our understanding of the drivers of need, including deprivation, and the impact in rural areas on service delivery. Fairness for all, delivered once and for all. And we will redouble our work to shift power away from Westminster into the hands of those communities who know their area best. We will reduce the myriad of funding pots that councils have to contend with, giving them the flexibility that they need to deliver local and national priorities. And this effort is underpinned by our strategy to streamline and simplify the local audit system in England. Local communities deserve transparency, accountability, and an effective early warning system that local audit provides. We are taking immediate action by replacing the broken and dispersed system with a focused, proportionate, and value for money local audit office, ensuring the system is fit for purpose. This is a long-term challenge, and it will take hard work and dedication to achieve, which is why we are wasting no time in fixing the foundations, getting the audit backlog under control, and overhauling the system for the long term, returning to secure multi-year settlements, bringing forward ambitious plans for devolution for growth and to reform local public services, while improving standards, accountability and efficiency. We are building for the long term, to get local government fighting fit, to be legal and to be decent, as equal partners, to rebuild our country from the ground up, ready to play its part in delivering the government's missions through our plan for change. I commend the statement to the House.
Shadow Minister David Simmons.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. It is Christmas. The two wise men and wise woman of the government have arrived bearing their gifts for local councils. But on closer inspection, whilst the gold is beautifully packaged, the box is somewhat emptier than people have been expecting. It's been a challenging few weeks. Mr Speaker, it's been a challenging few weeks for local government. We've heard the government's plans to take as much as they can of the local out of local government. And it's clear that this statement today will leave our local authorities facing further challenges in doing the day job and very significant uncertainty as we go into the new year. Mr Speaker, all of this is coming from a government that promised just a short time ago that it would end the bidding war, as they called it, between councils for money, then promptly started a new bidding war for homelessness funding. Rather than address it through this settlement, given that it is a core statutory duty of local authorities. And, Mr Speaker, the consequences of that, of the approach that government are setting out today, localism on central government terms only, represents just in London a £7 million net cut in the funding councils will have available to deal with homelessness at a time when rough sleeping is up 27%. Councils face uncertainty, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the cost of funding elections. The Minister told us just a few days ago that he was going to be considering whether to cancel local elections in places facing local government reorganisation. And up and down the country, in all of those local authorities, our returning officers are booking and paying for the polling stations. They're hiring the staff. They're carrying out the canvassing. They need certainty as we go into this new year. And of course, our councils also face additional and uncertain challenges announced in the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill and various statements made by other ministers, which clearly imply a very significant increase in the cost of new statutory duties coming the way of our local authorities, with no clarity about how that may be funded. And all of that on top of the cost of bringing forward local government reorganisation proposals to a deadline early in the new year. It's not clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, whose interests that serves. But for all of those local authorities that may be considering that, that represents a significant additional cost pressure. So in summary, as many of our councillors go away for their Christmas break and try and digest the detail of this with their Christmas lunch, they are going to be facing rumbling indigestion as they realise that their budget pressures are growing significantly, and especially in rural local authorities that face huge losses from the cancellation of funding that supported the additional and quantified costs of local government services in a rural environment. Now, I'm going to be fair to the Minister. The 2.7 billion black hole that we spotted at the time of the budget announcement has shrunk by around 700 million. But let me ask him, when it comes to council tax increases that will be announced by our local authorities in February, how much are they going to have to put the council tax up to meet the shortfalls here? How much are they going to have to put up council tax to cover the government's new approach to asylum, which is driving up the costs of temporary accommodation? When will they provide clarity on the dedicated schools grant override, given the impact that that has on our local authority budgets? When will they provide clarity on the election preparation costs? Given the Local Government Association has identified a 1.766 billion shortfall just from the government's national insurance contributions, when will they announce further funding to cover those costs? And when we consider the cancellation of the New Homes bonus means 3 million lost by Birmingham, 3.7 million lost by Buckinghamshire, 4 million from Central Beds, 5.3 million each from Ealing and Milton Keynes, North Yorkshire alone, 3.7 million from that, 14.3 million from rural services grant, an £18 million cut for a rural local authority in this budget, 9.5 million cut from Lincolnshire. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is clear there are very tough times ahead for local authorities as they begin to look at the detail. And the New Homes bonus in particular means that the places that have built the most homes are the ones that lose their benefit. Madam Deputy Speaker, if this is fixing the foundations, I wouldn't want to stay in the tent that's the only thing this would hold up in our local authorities.
Minister Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, here we go again. You would think after 14 years of councils being on year-by-year watch to find out what position they would be in, they would at least welcome the preparation now to multi-year settlements. They can't even, they had 14 years to get the house in order, and they couldn't even line up to give councils more than 12 months certainty about what was coming. But the one thing that councils were absolutely certain about is that it was only going to be bad news after bad news. When crisis in adult social care, in children's services, in homelessness, was rising at a rate of knots, and the government were completely missing in action. That's what councils were facing. And how many councils went bust on their watch? Councils lining up, exactly saying to the government that they couldn't afford. Well, let's talk about Birmingham, because they reference the £3 million New Homes bonus. The new recovery grant, £600 million of brand new money targeted at those councils with high deprivation and low tax bases, just for Birmingham, is £39 million. And that will begin to start the repair work, rebuilding of the foundations. And let me just say this. When we talk about fair funding and why it's needed, we are not going to do what the previous government did, where they put party politics ahead of the public interest. Let me remind them what the previous Prime Minister, the member for Richmond, said in Tunbridge Wells in 2022. We inherited a bunch of formulas from Labour that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, and that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that. That is a record of shame. It's nothing to preach about. And what this government will do to right the wrongs of the last 14 years and finally get money where it's needed. Public service, not party interest.
Select Committee Chair Florence Ashrawi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for outlining this much-needed uplift in funding today. And I agree with him in that our councils up and down the country, regardless of political persuasion, need a government to support them, not to criticise and denigrate them, which is what we have sadly had in some cases over the last 14 years. And the Minister mentioned some of the authorities that are still facing those pressures, including Birmingham, Nottingham and Woking, who've already effectively faced bankruptcy. And the LGA has outlined that some, as up to 1 in 4, are likely to need additional emergency support. A report from Sky today outlined that families are stuck in temporary accommodation for an average of 5.5 years. We should not be calling this temporary accommodation. Can you imagine spending the whole entirety of your school life in temporary accommodation, not having your own home? The homelessness funding announced today by the Minister are welcome, but if we're honest, there are sticking plaster in that they do not give the councils the tools to build social housing. So I asked the Minister, these new homes the homelessness will only end if we build the new homes. So what steps is he ensuring to ensure councils have those powers? In the short term, the £80 billion boost in the homelessness prevention grant is a step in the right direction, but there are also unintended consequences which the government must look at, because the new rules means that 49% of the grant may go on those gaps. Local authorities are already reliant on the funding gaps to plug the measures in temporary accommodation, with many using 75% of the grant on this. This will be impossible under the new rules. So can the Minister please tell the House how this change will not lead to more reduction in temporary accommodation funding at a time when we all know that the system is broken?
Can I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for that question? I mean, in the end, but particularly as we're all kind of getting ready for Christmas and we're all looking forward to that time with our families and our own respite, it's quite hard to enjoy that moment with the prospect of just how many children are in temporary accommodation in this country. 159,000 children who haven't got a secure, affordable place to live, who are in temporary accommodation. And in my own town, that's 500 children. And we do our best. We marshal for the Christmas parties that charities put on. But it's no replacement for a family home that is secure. And so I just say this, there'll be lots of differences and there'll be lots of exchanges that take place here, but we need just to focus on why we're doing what we're doing. The reason why we're building 1.5 million new homes, of course it is economic, it is about those decent, well-paid working class jobs, and we'll talk a lot about that. But in the end, it's about sorting out a housing crisis. And if we can sort out the crisis in housing, we sort out the temporary accommodation crisis and the financial crisis in local government. If we sort out the crisis in adult social care, of course we sort out the financial crisis. But we finally deliver on that promise that the state looks after the generation that gave so much. If we sort out the crisis in children's social care, we finally deliver on that state promise that we invest in the next generation coming forward. And so repairing the foundations, of course, it's about financial foundations, that's important. But it's about people, communities, and in the end, that's what we're all here for.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I refer the House to my register of interest as a member of BCP Council. Local government was brought to its knees under the last Conservative government with funding slashed and responsibilities piled on its depleted and exhausted workforce. And I want to thank the workforce of local government at this time and wish them a happy Christmas. I and my local Liberal Democrat colleagues welcome the move for multi-year settlements, something that we've long called for, and the funding announced today for homelessness prevention. I agree with the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister that we must eliminate the use of B&B, especially for families at Christmas. And I also welcome the consultation announced around changing our funding formula, as listening to our local leaders is absolutely crucial. However, we remain really concerned about the removal of the Rural Services Grant, which suggests that the government really don't understand the nature of rural communities, including the difficulties of providing services over sometimes vast areas and the needs of issues like subsidising public transport and identifying hidden poverty often amongst much older populations that actually cost an awful lot to fund. But turning to special educational needs, it is deeply worrying that councils still have no idea about what is going to happen to the statutory override. And I'd like to ask him how they're supposed to set their budgets in February without this certainty, especially those like Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole that may literally run out of money. Can he confirm that no council will be forced to join schemes like Safety Valve, which risk the right support being provided to some of the most vulnerable children? But the impact on social care as we go into winter is of greatest concern. Dorset Council shared a letter with me that was sent to the Dorset Care Association, in which the Director of Adult Social Care states, "We simply will not have the resources to meet the national insurance contribution for providers." And indeed, a written question the Minister gave me said that only direct national insurance costs would be covered. What does he say to those providers and to the staff in charities like Diverse Abilities who fear for their jobs this Christmas?
Well, I mean, it's important that we have a debate on government finance based on the numbers. And I've said already that no council, when taking into account council's tax, will see a reduction in their core spending power. And for her own council, that means at least, and this is before the final settlement, it doesn't include extended producer responsibility, it doesn't include large parts of the grant, but outside of all that, we'll see an increase of 5.8%. And we are covering the national insurance contributions made there. And in addition, we are funding an extra £880 million through the social care grant. So we've heard representations through the sector, but we're not saying that all this will fix everything today. It can't. You know, we're less than 6 months into the new government and we've got 14 years to reconcile. And I hope she doesn't mind, but I am going to remind her that a number of those 14 years were under the coalition government. And what we really miss there that we're now trying to make up is that if we take away that community preventative services that we all know make the big difference, not just in terms of cost but outcomes, then we end up paying at the back end anyway, but actually more and more for worst outcomes. And the cruelty is, the moment that they had in government, except it was quite short, but that moment in government was the time when we should have invested in reform and prevention. And that time wasn't taken, the opportunity was missed, and it's now 14 years later that we're having to reconcile that and fix the system from the ground up, and we will do that.
Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome this commitment to local government today and recognise that the Minister has a big job to do to fill some of the challenges that have arisen because of the last 14 years, not least in local government audit. And I welcome what seems to be a commitment to embrace the Redmond review, but could you give more detail about what will replace the Office for Local Government?
Minister.
Can I thank the member for that question? I think most in the sector would agree that Oflog, as it stands, the Office of Local Government, had a vague remit, that it was an expensive way of gathering data, and in the end, if it was to be developed, it would potentially risk mission creep, that it would verge into the areas of the previous Audit Commission in the way that was so disliked by local authorities. What we are trying to do is to get the right balance between that early warning system that enables us to see which individual councils are under stress, but also, importantly, whether there are any systemic threats developing where there are themes coming through in terms of liabilities where central government might have to take action much earlier on. So we want to rebuild that early warning system. But we're absolutely clear we are not replacing the Audit Commission. One, it was hugely expensive, and we need to make sure that if there is money, it goes to the front line of local public services. But honestly, councils do not need inspectors going in, marking homework, when councils should be trusted to get on and do the job well. And so we hope through the local audit office, because people understand what the national audit office is and will bring that with the local audit office, that people will see the benefit of that and it will be embraced by the sector.
Joy Morrissey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would the Minister set out how he expects local authorities like my own in Buckinghamshire to absorb with such little notice multi-million-pound impacts from significant changes to the social care funding formula and the effects of NIC's tax rate on the commissioned services and suppliers, particularly charities like mine, that will be greatly affected by these changes?
Well, again, I can say that her own council will see a core spending power increase of 5%. And that's 5% of this part of the settlement. It doesn't include extended producer responsibility. It doesn't include billions of pounds of other grants that will come. So we need to be clear here that this is a genuine attempt, and I think we have succeeded in a very difficult context, of making sure that we give councils the funding that are needed. But it stands as a matter of fact that some councils' local tax bases are stronger for reasons that go back many years and many centuries in some cases, not because of the efforts of the local council, because it is what it is. And what we found for too long is that councils in deprived communities with lower tax bases have done everything that's been asked. They have raised council tax to the maximum, local communities are paying more and more, but increasingly for less and less because they're seeing their neighbourhood service diminish. So there are tough choices, and we don't shy away from that. We are very honest on the face of the oral statement about the trade-offs that have had to be made. But for our own council, in core spending power, a 5% increase will absolutely help deal with the issues that she raised.
Pete Dowd. Peter, sorry.
To see the wise men and woman on our front benches than Ebenezer Scrooge and Jacob Marley on the other side. Would he agree with me that the statement he has made today is in stark contrast to the legacy left by the benches opposite, which left local government in dire straits?
And I think that's a point, really, because the previous government knew just how bad it was, but they put off the tough decisions. So, by way of an example, how many times did the previous government promise in 14 years that they would come back to multi-year settlements that councils knew where they're up to, but they failed to do it? How many times did the previous government say that they would bring in a fair funding review, but they failed to do it? How many times did the previous government say that they would deal with the audit backlog, but they didn't just fail to do it, it got worse. Hadn't we have taken action, it would have been 1,000 sets of audited accounts, and it wasn't about COVID. Those accounts went back to 2015. This was systemic, and it was all on the watch of the previous government. What that meant in practice was £100 billion of public money that they couldn't account for. So they didn't really know the state of the sector because they completely gave up monitoring it.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following on from the question from my honourable friend for Beaconsfield and the answer the Minister gave, can I assure him that there are areas of deprivation in rural communities like Buckinghamshire? And further to the point my honourable friend the Shadow Minister made of whilst the devil's in the detail, the figures already looking like Buckinghamshire will take a multi-million-pound hit from the loss of various grants. Can the Minister give an assurance that rural communities will actually be treated equally to urban communities and that they will not be left behind?
I think he's maybe either doesn't know the status of the Rural Service Delivery Grant or is trying to mislead the House. The Rural Service Delivery Grant was not about rural services. There was a large share of rural authorities that should have got the grant who didn't get it. Because it was not about that. When the Prime Minister previously stood up in Tunbridge Wells and said that they have taken money from deprived communities and moved it across, he didn't just mean it for rural communities, he meant for party politics. So where were the previous government on the rural communities that didn't get the grant? I didn't hear anybody standing up asking for their rural community to get the money for those services that they're now trying to champion. What we will absolutely do through the funding reforms that are coming is to make sure that deprivation are neither part of that, but also that we do genuinely take into account the cost of delivering services in rural areas. The sector needs a fair funding review, and we're determined to deliver it.
Helen Hayes.
Statement, and particularly the additional funding to tackle homelessness and early help and support for families. I also welcome the principle that resources should be directed according to need. The Minister will know, however, that the elephant in the room of local government finance is the statutory override for SEND-related deficits, due to come to an end in March 2026. Councils will be setting their budgets in the new year through to the end of March 2026. And if there is no plan to address the SEND deficits, many councils will be issuing Section 114 notices. Councils urgently need certainty at this point. So can I ask the Minister what discussions are taking place with local authorities about the statutory override and when they will have the certainty that they need?
Minister.
Well, I share the importance and also the significance put on the statutory override, and it's something that is very acutely felt in the department and in the sector. So we're out to consultation now on a number of matters that includes dealing with the statutory override. We're in constant dialogue with the Treasury about how we deal with that in the long term. In the end, it's another example of the legacy that we've inherited, where these very difficult decisions to reconcile, to reform and to repair the system that should have been taken earlier just weren't, but it's very much on our agenda.
Select Committee Member Lee Dillon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd also refer members to my register of interests as a member of West Berkshire Council. And last Christmas, I was the leader of West Berkshire Council. And I can honestly say to the Minister that I would much rather receive in my inbox the settlement proposed by the government than what I received in my inbox from the Conservative government. In the statement, the Minister talks about fixing the foundations, and I welcome the £3.7 billion for social care. But would the Minister agree that with councils spending up to 2/3 of their budget on adult and children's social care, that actually to be able to fix the foundations, social care needs full-scale reform? And would he support our calls on this side of the House for a commission to undertake that piece of work? Thank you.
I'll be honest, we can absolutely agree that we need to reform, but I believe the urgency is today. You know, we think about the number of older people who would have been entitled to adult social care in 2010 who now don't even get the support from the local authority because eligibility has changed in so many areas. There is a crisis, and the crisis isn't just being felt in the homes of older people who have given to this country and deserve better, frankly. It's felt in the acute sector, it's felt in the health service, where we are paying actually far more at the back end because we haven't got that community preventative services in place. And so we're working with the Cabinet Office and Treasury to say, well, let's learn as we go to some of this in terms of innovation and pilots where we can invest to save, invest in those community preventative services up front to try and reduce that demand better. Of course, it's about money, but in the end, it's about the service that we provide. And I appreciate his comments about the settlement in the round.
Sean Davies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I refer members to my member's interest as a councillor in South and Wrekin and also an honorary vice president of the Local Government Association. Can I welcome this welcome first step by the government to restore funding for local government after what has been a very difficult 14 years. But in places like mine, which is fast growing in its population, provides outstanding services, is providing leadership to the sector, that on all three of those counts, up until this point, that has not been reflected in the settlement that Health and Wrekin Council has received. And will this government change that? Can I also just gently remind the House that when I was chair of the Local Government Association over the last couple of years, there wasn't a single Conservative councillor who thought the settlement and the approach by the last government was a fair and proportionate one.
Minister.
Well, I'm pleased to say that this year the core spending power, again, not taking into account billions of pounds of money that will then follow, will be 8.1%. And that reflects the service demand pressures, but also the reality of the local tax bases in that area. Telford, like many areas, does a very good job at providing local public services, but they themselves recognise that the neighbourhood services that most people see, feel and make a difference to quality of life have been the services that have been retreated on because of those targeted services in social care in particular. And so we are absolutely determined to rebuild on adult social care, children's, and to sort out the housing crisis. But we also want people to live in good places that they're proud of, and that requires those neighbourhood services to be rebuilt. It will take time to do that, but our commitment to Telford and to the rest of the country is we're absolutely determined to do it.
Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The core spending power tables that the government have published today show the total government funding for South Staffordshire is down by 7.5%. What does the government have against council tax payers in South Staffordshire?
Minister.
I'm surprised, given his background, that he's displaying such ignorance of council finance. The government's role in local government finance is to be an equaliser. And so everywhere has the ability to raise tax locally through council tax and business rates. He will know that, but he'll also know that some areas have the ability to raise far more because of their tax base than other councils. It's the job of the government to equalise, to make sure that when it comes to demand for services, that everywhere gets the service provision that they need. That requires government in some places to provide more funding to reconcile that lower tax base so that everyone gets the services that is entitled to. So the presentation that he offers shows ignorance or politics, but I think the country deserves better.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Could I very much welcome the statement today and the extra funding that's announced as well. And could I commend the Minister for reminding the party opposite of 14 years of austerity when local government had bigger cuts to its budgets than any other part of the public sector. And while that was happening, of course, the Lib Dems were party to the coalition government when the worst of those cuts were made. Could I ask my honourable friend then two questions? One, when he comes to look at the more fundamental reforms, which won't be in place, we accept, for another year, will he have a look at the council tax system as a whole? It's an unfair, it's a regressive system that takes a disproportionate amount of money from the poorest people in the poorest houses. And will he also just confirm in the local audit office, this is going to be a standalone body which looks at public sector audit and not an add-on to ARGA, which was a previous proposal, which was basically a private sector body which looked at local government as an afterthought.
Can I thank the former chair of the Select Committee for that question? I can confirm that core spending power on the element of this settlement for Sheffield will be 8.5%. That's before additional funds that will follow. So Sheffield gets a good settlement in this, but we recognise that in the context of growing demand, and so we hope the council see that we are meeting them on that challenge that they face. On the questions of council tax and whether we'll review that, I think every government recognises there are huge limitations with council tax. There are also huge geographical variations in council tax, and by its nature, it is regressive. That's the nature of a tax that is based on property values rather than the income of the people there. However, council tax is understood, its collection rates are high, and it's really the foundation of council services. It's not the total, and he knows this, of course, but of council services. The real issue that we need to face now, as in the urgent issue, is that government previously have moved away from their role as the equaliser to the system. And where that revenue support grant used to be in place to support councils to reconcile lower tax bases, government were missing in action. Well, we're saying to councils of all political stripes, across every type of authority, across every part of the country, that we will reconcile that and we will work with them to be the equaliser on that measure. On the local audit office, we are absolutely determined this will not be a return to the audit commission. And I suppose we're trying to do a number of things. One, we want to rebuild that early warning system to make sure that we see the systemic problems that are developing in the system. But we also recognise that the cost of audit has increased by 150%, and that is a direct cost to taxpayers. And also there is fragmentation in the market, where we need to look at the fallback position, I suppose, for auditor supply. So there's quite a lot that we need to deal with, but this is very much about that provision of audit and making sure the early warning system is built. It's certainly not about a bloated inspection regime.
I know the Minister wants to give thorough responses, but I have absolute confidence he can do that with fewer words. Caroline Warden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Government's statement and its attention to local government finances. Delivering services in large, dispersed rural areas like mine in South Devon is challenging and costly. So what plans does the Minister have to ensure that rural local authorities will be allocated additional funding to manage this extra cost of delivering services across rural areas like mine? Thank you.
Minister.
And that's exactly the point. So when we move to a fairer funding formula, and of course we'll consult on the component parts that make that up, we do have to take it in the round, because like genuinely I want any part of the country, any type of local authority to be able to interrogate it and say, even if they disagree with the quantum, and there'll always be arguments about the quantum, the rationale holds and the evidence base holds. And it's a matter of fact that the cost of rural service delivery is accepted. There is a premium just because of the travel, say if you're a home care worker, the travel times in between appointments and the rest of it. I think though it's probably accepted too that the evidence base isn't as robust and strong as it needs to be. So we want to make sure that through the process we take it into account, but the evidence base is strong and robust as well.
Chianwara.
Speaker, 40 years of Tory austerity and fiscal mismanagement has halved the central government funding for Newcastle City Council, sucked the blood vampire-like from our local economy and left local businesses and families drowning in uncertainty. So I welcome this increased funding and the specific commitments on housing and social care. But can he reassure me that there is further light at the end of the tunnel, that the work that this government is doing on public service reform, local funding reform, business rates reform and innovation and investment reform will mean that the people of Newcastle and indeed the North East will have the power and the resources to build the public services and the economy that we choose?
Minister.
I think that's completely right. There is no council, and I would say, by the way, credit to council officials, to frontline workers and to councillors. If you look across government, it is local government that has led on innovation, it's local government that has led on reform, and it's local government that has bound together local communities in very difficult times. I would say too often, with other parts of the system working against the local interest and not with it. And we need to find a way not of sending a message to local government, because I think it's understood. It's saying to the wider system that when we make that public sector investment in Newcastle and other places, that we expect all of the system to rally around a single plan for the place and for its people, and for local government to be respected as the local leaders, the conveners of place, to hold the ring on that, to make sure that there isn't duplication, there isn't contradictions, and money is going to deliver the right outcomes for local people, and we're absolutely committed to that.
James Wild.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Large rural counties like Norfolk face higher costs in delivering their services, and the government's jobs tax add £14 million to the pressures that Norfolk County Council is facing. So can he clarify whether the NICS funding he referred to in his statement going to Norfolk County Council and other councils covers the cost of social care commissioned services or not?
Minister.
I mean, first of all, I pay tribute to the leaders in both Norfolk and Suffolk for the conversations that we're having on devolution in particular, and we look forward, hopefully, to make progress on that in the near future, because that's where the real prize is. We can sort out the foundations of council funding, we can reorganise public services to get efficiencies out, but in the end we need to see devolution, we need to see power coming out of this place and given to local communities, and the best way to achieve that is through a mayoral strategic authority working hand in glove with a local authority. On the direct question about NICS, we've provided over £500 million here for direct costs to national insurance contributions for the employers, and we're providing additional money through the social care grant, and it's for council to decide how best to spend that money.
Emma Foodie.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Minister's statement and that this government is starting to fix the damage done by more than a decade of disastrous settlements for local government. In my constituency, that means more than 5% increases for each local authority in core spending power. But does the Minister agree with me that, as if not more important, is the consultation on long-term proposals to fundamentally improve the way that local government is funded through a fairer system?
Yeah. That's exactly right. We have approached this year very much as a recovery operation. We see that councils were in the ditch and they needed to be pulled out and taken home. And that's exactly what this one-year settlement will do. But what they need and deserve is a multi-year settlement that gives long-term security and stability. And for that long-term settlement not to be a continuation of a broken system, for it to be a system that has been rewired and put right. So the fair funding review and the multi-year settlement and the reform agenda, where we put prevention at the heart of public services, will begin to achieve that end that the member so rightly points to.
Tom Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard a lot from colleagues about the delivery of rural services. Harriet and Knaresborough was one of the areas that saw local government reorganisation, and we now are the largest geographic council in England. So I just want to know what reassurances there will be on making sure that rural services can be provided. I know one of the biggest barriers that we face as a council is being able to deliver homeschool transport, and we've seen the cost of that go from £5 million just a few years ago, and it's expected to be over £25 million this year.
Minister.
I've covered the rural service element before, so if I can just kind of home in on the homeschool transport issue, which I know is a huge issue in many county council areas where children are being carried further away to get to local school. I'll be honest and say some of that is absolutely required and has always been required. There's quite a lot of that, though, that is a result of quite a broken system where the educational provision in local communities isn't being provided and parents are being forced to move further out. The plan that we've got to rebuild education, to invest in schools, some of it funded through implications on private schools to get that money into the state sector, is about rebuilding that local education provision so parents have the choice and confidence to go to the local state school nearest to their home. That will have an impact on council budgets on home school transport.
Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. After 8 years of Conservative rule in Stoke-on-Trent, the council was taken to the brink of bankruptcy, and the Minister will be well aware of the extraordinary financial support that we've received and are having additional conversations on. So could I ask the Minister how the Recovery Fund will interact with those authorities that are in receipt of extraordinary financial support? Can I take this time, Madam Deputy Speaker, to put on record the thanks from the City of Councillor Alistair Watson and John Rouse, the Chief Executive, for the work they've done to stabilise council finances in difficult times?
Can I thank the member for that question, and also share in his tribute to council officers and the council leadership in Stoke-on-Trent. So as a direct cash payment, the down payment that I mentioned earlier on, Stoke-on-Trent Council will get £8.7 million. Their core spending power will increase by 8.6% just in this round, but they will very easily see that be well over 10% by the time the full allocations come through. That is part of that rebuilding process, and it reflects, again, as I said before, that we cannot punish councils because of their inherited historic tax base. We've got to make sure that the government steps up to its role to equalise the system so everyone has fair access to public services.
Clive Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for his statement. I recognise and accept the importance of proper funding for areas of high deprivation, but it is important to acknowledge that councils with low deprivation face rising demand for their services. In my constituency, Wokingham, children with SEND are suffering from this lack of investment. They are deprived too, but in ways that are not being measured, and so their council is not getting the funding that it crucially requires to look after SEND services properly. If we want Wokingham Borough Council to get on with the job of delivering more for local residents, how will the Minister ensure that Wokingham receive what it needs?
Minister.
Can I thank the honourable member for the question, also thank him for coming to one of our surgeries to make representations on behalf of his council. I know that he cares about these issues. I will say that we need to be careful not to think that those who have received the recovery grant are getting it because they are the only places that have deprivation. That is not the case. The recovery grant is very targeted and has two components. One is the strength of the local tax base. So if you're an area with a weaker tax base, that is a factor, but also a high deprivation. And those are areas with significantly higher deprivation than other comparable areas in receipt of that. But we are clear that we need to root out deprivation of need wherever it exists. And the idea of the fair funding review is we'll take into account many different component parts, one of which will be the cost of rural service delivery, some of it will be general overhead, some of it will be premises costs, some of it will be deprivation and need and the rest of it, to make sure that whatever the issue, whatever the context, councils have confidence that the funding is correct.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister and his team for listening to the voices of Portsmouth North and the additional funding allocated to homelessness and rough sleeping, so that Portsmouth City Council projected deficit can be addressed. Madam Deputy Speaker, it would be remiss of me not to thank the council workers alongside Bev and all of the volunteers at Helping Hands and other charities in the city who have supported the growing number of people on our streets under the shameful Tory coalition, reign and recklessness. Madam Deputy Speaker, can the Minister confirm that after 5 months in government this is just the start of additional support for our councils, and can he also clarify that should the Lib Dem run Portsmouth City Council need further advice, his door is always open?
Minister.
Yeah, can I thank for that question? Also congratulate her on her PMQ earlier on and making the case for that. So the council's overall core spending power will increase by 7.8%. Portsmouth to one side, we do know that whatever measures we take in the general terms We can never cast the net so wide and so thinly that we catch absolutely every council who are at the extreme ends of that. If we did, it would never get to the depth that's needed. So the door is absolutely open to any council that needs a conversation about their particular circumstance. And regardless of party politics, they can have absolute confidence that we will deal with it professionally, appropriately, and with the respect that's needed for those councils.
Members will know if they're not here for the opening statements that they will not be called during the statements. Callum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I draw the House's attention to my declaration of interest as a county councillor in Oxfordshire. In my constituency and in my surgeries and correspondence, the frustration, desperation and anger of parents and children with special education needs is constant and shocking. Their needs are not currently being met. And as the Minister has acknowledged, the funding shortfall for the high needs block is significant and has led to a deficit which the Local Government Association estimates will be £3.6 billion at the end of this financial year. So I very much welcome the Minister's focus on this and that of his colleagues in the Department for Education. And can he assure parents and children in my constituency that come the multi-year settlement to which he's referred, the needs of these children will be adequately met for the future and the needs of the councils who currently face these huge deficits will be addressed?
Minister.
Yes, I can confirm that we are providing, with the support of the Department for Education, new funding of £1 billion to support the high needs block in SEND for the reasons that he says. But we also know that money today is not the answer in the long term. We've got to reform SEND provision in the mainstream so that parents and pupils get the support that they need.
Josh Winter-Glynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the money for homelessness in today's statement. Evidence increasingly suggests that prevention works in homelessness. Calderdale is one of 3 local authorities who are working with Crisis to pilot a system of early prevention, which has already in 6 months led to a 20% reduction in people using temporary accommodation. Will the Honourable Member look at this work and commit to championing what works?
Sir.
I mean, that's a very good point, really, that where councils like Calderdale are doing well and excelling, they are working hand in glove with the local community and for volunteer organisations to make sure that they get the coverage to really reach into communities. So I absolutely applaud that work, and I hope that the 7.4% uplift in core spending power in this part of the settlement goes some way to supporting them.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for a positive statement in relation to the funding that's available. Government policy states that local government is the foundation of a good state, from bin collections to driving economic growth. I believe it is paramount that this is done across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So can I ask the Minister this very specific question? What discussions has the Minister or will the Minister have with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland regarding the possibility of securing greater funding through the Barnett Consequential to ensure that Northern Ireland can have the funding that they need to stimulate local and community and economic growth? Thanks so much.
Minister.
I'll probably be a bit careful, given it's a statement for councils in England, not to stray into that. But I think the premise of the question about adequate funding for local public services is correct. And let's remember that councils deliver over 800 different services to local communities in England. They employ over 1 million people, many of which will be local people of the community. They're a huge power and force for good, and I'll certainly make sure that the representation that he has made is passed on to the Secretary for Northern Ireland.
Deirdre Costigan.
Massive cuts to local government services by the previous Conservative government have seen rough sleeping more than doubled, and families in temporary accommodation regularly forced to move from hotel to hotel with their belongings in black sacks. So I welcome the record £14.7 million in homelessness funding his department has awarded to Ealing Council, almost a £4 million increase. But can the Minister outline how this will help those people sleeping out in West Ealing and in Southall Town Centre tonight, and how it will end the use of hotels and bed and breakfasts for families in Ealing Southall?
Minister.
Well, I mean, that's precisely why we've provided an extra £233 million in order to meet the demand. But we don't take any pleasure or pride in that, actually. We think it is not a sign of a system that's working that we have to keep on providing more and more money into temporary accommodation, to the benefit of hotel owners and not the people who need a safe, secure and affordable home. And so this has got to be part of a wider plan, and that's why the 1.5 million new homes are just so important. If we don't provide those safe, affordable homes for people, we're always going to be in this cycle of trying to play catch-up, and it's not sustainable.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I too welcome the absolute multi-year certainty that's given by the statement today. As a former Deputy Leader of Milton Keynes Council, this is the kind of certainty we asked for, rather than getting a letter on Christmas Eve, usually, setting out what it might be, already halfway through our budget setting process. I also welcome the fact that Milton Keynes is getting over 7 million to prevent homelessness, and can I welcome the fact that there'll be transparency. But can he give reassurances to Milton Keynes that with the loss of the new homes bonus, there will be additional funding given to Milton Keynes to make up for that difference?
Minister.
Can I thank you for the question, and also for the advocacy that she shows for Milton Keynes and for the local authority there. Overall, core spending power in Milton Keynes will increase by 6.1%. That's only part of the settlement here. They can very easily expect that to increase in the final settlement, and that shows that the government is working in partnership with the council to deal with the issues that she raises.
Natasha Irons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the extra funding going in to tackle homelessness, especially the £15 million allocated to the Croydon Council to tackle homelessness there. But after 14 years of members opposite turning their backs on local councils, local councillors and the communities that they serve, does the Minister agree with me that there is a cost to doing nothing when it comes to reforming local government funding? And can he outline what kind of support might be available to councils who are still carrying large amounts of debt?
Thank you. I think there is a legitimate question to ask probably the previous government about why on earth councils in some cases were allowed to borrow to the extent that they were, proportionate to their revenue. In the end, some councils have found themselves on the wrong side of that. And I'll be honest, when we're designing the recovery grant, that is about deprivation, it's about low tax bases. When we're dealing with the quantum, that's about directing money to particular services. There will always be councils, and Croydon will be one of them, that because of their unique situations, it's outside of that general allocation, but we are ready to have one-to-one support conversations where needed.
Chris Vince.
Thank you, Madam. Wish you a lovely Christmas break. And can I welcome... Don't put me off. Can I take an opportunity to welcome the Minister for his statement today? As someone that worked for a homeless charity in Harlow, I welcome the at least an additional £1.2 million worth of funding to support homelessness and rough sleeping in Harlow, as well as an additional £1.6 million of funding to neighbouring districts, which partly overlap myself and the member opposite. I would also like to mention, coupled with the multi-year funding for councils, which is something that I achieved cross-party support for in Harlow District Council Chamber. Does the Minister agree with me that this shows a clear desire by this government to support the most vulnerable people in my constituency, but that it must come with joined-up thinking with the £1.5 million new homes planned and also the investment in our NHS?
Minister.
That's a very cute way to get a long question in. Merry Christmas, Madam Deputy Speaker. He's absolutely right, and can I pay tribute to the work that he does to represent the people of Harlow and also the local authority, and we absolutely stand ready to work for those long-term funding settlement issues to make sure that we genuinely rebuild the foundations.
Peter Lamb.
Thank you. I commend the Minister for his work in bringing forward this settlement to secure a fair deal for the sector. But the elephant in the room is temporary housing, as many members have alluded to. In large part due to decisions taken by the party opposite to freeze a housing benefit subsidy at 2011 levels and to cap the LHA at a far lower level than local housing tends to cost. The end result being that local government is subsidising central government's welfare bill to an astounding extent, with 2/3 of the council tax in my local area going towards paying that bill. Will the Minister take on his role as an advocate for the sector to meet with his counterparts in the relevant departments to try and finally lift this so that we can actually get people housed at a far cheaper rate, both financially and socially?
I mean, again, we come back to the state of a broken housing market. You know, the need to build 1.5 million new homes is there, but also, let's be clear, they have to be the right homes in the right places for the need in the local area. And that does mean more social homes, but it also means directly council provision. Because if we continue to see the cycle, and we've all seen the inflation figures today driven by private rent, there is no benefit at all for the taxpayer continually paying more and more for often substandard accommodation that doesn't even meet a decent home standard. We've got to rebuild council housing, social housing, and make it fit for purpose and affordable.
David Baines.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and Merry Christmas. Can I thank the... I won't get any longer, I don't think. Can I ask can I thank the Minister for his statement, and can I welcome the announcements made today? St Helens Borough Council in 2010, under the last year of the last Labour government, received £127 million in central government funding. Under the Conservatives, that was cut to just £13 million a year. You can't run services on thin air, and despite the best efforts of council staff and Labour councillors, cuts have had consequences. Can the Minister assure me and my constituents that under this government we'll get the funding we need for the essential services we need?
Minister.
Well, I mean, that's exactly the reason why core spending power in St Helens will increase by 8.6% just through these measures. Given the type of council, could easily expect that to top over 10%. And that's our down payment to say we need time to prepare for the multi-year settlement, we need to do the fair funding review, but we know that councils can't wait for that given the last decade in the way that he describes.
And the last question goes to the ever-patient.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for squeezing me in, and I refer the House to my register of members' interests. I was glad to hear my honourable friend refer to the unfair funding formula championed by the previous Prime Minister, laser-targeted as it was of reducing support from communities like mine. There are parts of Gateshead where the average life expectancy for a man is 73, and yet the last government focused wholeheartedly on reducing support to areas of deprivation like that. So I welcome the almost £2 million that Gateshead Council is receiving to tackle homelessness this year on top of its previous allocation. But I do ask, given one of the shameful legacies of the last government is crumbling infrastructure in communities like mine, what efforts will be made to support councils like mine with the infrastructure they need?
Minister.
Well, I mean, in the end, some of it is a quantum of funding, but some of it is also the freedoms of funding. So taking away the ring fencing, taking away the reporting is absolutely critical for that. And Gateshead and every other council have our absolute commitment. May I say, Madam Speaker, finally, a thank you to the millions of public sector workers, to council officials, and importantly, to councillors for the work that they do in providing good public services every year, day in, day out. And can I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a happy Settlement Day.
I'll give the front bench a few moments to shuffle over as we prepare for the next statement on winter preparedness. Minister is ready. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement on winter preparedness. And before I begin, I want to say a very special thank you to all the staff who will be keeping our NHS going over the Christmas holidays and into the new year. And when I was a manager in the NHS, I worked on winter planning. So if I can also make an extra additional thank you to all those people who often aren't unseen, but the managers and admin staff that also keep the system going. Because I know how hard it is for people to work in this system, the challenges that winter can bring with increased demand and higher rates of infection. There are things we can't predict. Storms Bertz and Dara have added pressure and we might have a cold snap. I know many people like a winter cold snap of snow and ice, but it's not something the NHS ever wants to see. The NHS has excellent people that have done this before, and unlike last year, thanks to this new government, many of them won't be on strike. And while we can't control the weather, we can plan, prepare and pull together. So today I want to update colleagues with the current picture before moving on to the things we are doing. NHS England and the UK Health Security Agents will publish the latest statistics tomorrow morning as usual, but we do know that levels of seasonal illness are high. The most recent figures show that last week there was a 350% increase in flu cases compared to the same week last year, but this is comparable to levels we saw 2 years ago. Norovirus cases are high, COVID rates are low, and although RSV rates have been high, we expect them to start coming down over the next few weeks. And I want to make it clear that the current rate for both bed occupancy and ambulance delays are unacceptably high, and I will shortly come on to measures about how we are dealing with that capacity. I'm not going to re-rehearse the Darcy investigation and his findings, except on one thing, to remind the House that he found, and I quote, a perpetual bed crisis, particularly during peak periods like winter cold snaps. This means every winter our staff have been wasting precious time solving process problems, ringing round wards to find beds, and desperately trying to hold the system together. And you can see this in the figures. Yeah. On an average evening in 2009, a patient would have been 39th in the queue when they arrived at a typical A&E. In 2024, Madam Deputy Speaker, they would be 100th. The 4-hour A&E standard has not been met for nearly a decade, and ambulance response times have not been consistently achieved since their introduction in 2017. In November, the average ambulance response time stood at 42 minutes, which is more than double the NHS constitutional standard. Yeah. A third of 2.3 million people who attended A&E last month waited more than 4 hours. And 1 in 10 of those people, more than 150,000, waited for more than 12 hours in A&E. These life and death delays are the result of deep structural issues in the NHS that can't and won't be fixed overnight. But this winter, Madam Deputy Speaker, NHS staff will be on the front lines, not the picket lines, because we took a different approach on how to work with staff and the unions. To resolve the resident doctors' dispute, we spoke to them on day 1, we met them in week 1, and by week 4 we'd negotiated a deal to end their strikes. That's why, for the first time in 3 years, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government are fully focused on winter and not focused on planning for strikes. So this is what we're doing. First, the NHS is managing extra demand by strengthening same-day emergency care, offering more full services for older people with an upgraded 24-hour live data centres. Second, we're continuing to support systems that are struggling with direct intervention through NHS Urgent and Emergency Care Tiering Programme. Third, the Secretary of State is chairing weekly meetings with myself and senior leaders to make sure we're managing pressures across the entire system. Last week, he specially convened with Trust and told them to prioritise patient safety by focusing on key metrics, including emergency ambulance response times, addressing handover delays and tackling the longest waits in A&E. And we've made it crystal clear that we do not want to see Trust prioritising patients who can be seen and discharged more quickly over those with the greatest clinical need, because this government will always prioritise people, not performance. And this morning, the NHS has published a letter outlining how they were prioritising patient safety. Fourthly, I'm taking steps to ensure we get a clear picture of what's happening on the ground. I recently visited Newham Hospital, A&E, Bristol Southmead and the head offices of NHS England to see the aforementioned Operational Control Centre, where they receive data in real time and respond to problems as they emerge. And fifth, Madam Deputy Speaker, we launched a national comms campaign in the autumn. This is encouraging people across the country to take their winter vaccines with a particular focus on people who are less likely to come forward. This last point is essential because the best and easiest way to keep people out of hospital this Christmas is to encourage them to come forward and get vaccinated. For instance, last year, people who received a COVID vaccine were half as likely to be admitted to hospital compared to those who didn't. So far, we've delivered over 17 million flu jabs, 9.5 million COVID jabs, and we introduced the first ever public vaccination campaign for RSV, with over 1 million vaccinations delivered and counting, protecting young babies and the elderly. In total, we've delivered nearly 28 million vaccinations for this winter, and I want to thank every person who's come forward to protect themselves and the vulnerable. And now I'd like to speak directly to anyone who hasn't been vaccinated. No one wants to be separated from their family and stuck in hospital this Christmas, and there's a real risk that maybe you'll inadvertently take home flu to loved ones this year. So please protect yourself, your family and NHS services, and book your appointment today, because tomorrow is the last day you can book a vaccine through the NHS app or the NHS website, although after tomorrow, obviously, there are local solutions. Madam Deputy Speaker, while we tackle winter pressures in the short term, we're also fixing the foundations of our NHS with long-term reform. 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister spoke to the nation about our plan for change and set out our ambitions for the health service over this Parliament. We will get a grip on waiting lists and return to 92% of patients waiting no longer than 18 weeks from referral to treatment by the end of this Parliament. We're also taking action on social care, introducing the largest increase in the carers' allowance weekly earnings limit since 1976. We will ensure carers' allowance meets its objectives while reviewing unpaid carers' leave and looking at the benefits of introducing paid carers' leave. We will publish an improved Better Care Fund framework using £9 billion of funding to provide better, more integrated health and social care for patients and people who draw on care. We're helping disabled people on low incomes adapt their homes through the Disabled Facilities Grant. And the Employment Rights Bill is already going through committee stage, laying the foundations for the first ever pay agreement for care workers, as a first step towards building consensus on the long-term reform needed to create a national care service. By the end of our first year in government, we will deliver an extra 2 million operations, scans and appointments through innovation, investment into additional capacity and productivity gains. We are sharing the best of the NHS with the rest of the NHS, with our further, faster team. These are teams of experts that are supporting 20 trusts with long waits to tackle their waiting list and increase productivity. They've been deployed to 5 trusts so far, and we're already seeing improvements, for example, in theatres. For this financial year, the Government have committed £12 billion more in everyday spending on health and social care than was planned by the last government in the spring budget. And we are giving our capital-starved NHS the funding it so badly lacked over the past decade, setting aside at least £1.5 billion next year, which will create additional capacity, including new surgical hubs and diagnostic scanners and new beds across the estate, which will enable 30,000 additional procedures and over 1 million diagnostic tests as they come online. That's the difference a government of service makes. But we've also been clear, investment must come with reform. And Lord Darcy has given us the diagnosis, and the cure can be found in shifting the NHS from treatment to prevention, hospital to home and analogue to digital. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, Harold Wilson once called himself an optimist who carries a raincoat. As someone who has worked in our NHS at this critical time, I'm fully aware of the challenges we face and the effort that's required. And I'm making sure that we have a firm hold of problems in the short term while we do the work of fixing the foundations of the NHS with long-term reform. Over the past 14 years, we've limped from one crisis to the next, improvising and making do with sticking plasters. It can't go on. It's bad for patient care and it's totally demoralising for staff. We are building a health service that's fit for the future, ready to face every winter with confidence, and we will publish our 10-year plan for health in the spring. And anyone who thinks you can't do it should remember, we fixed the NHS before and we'll fix it again. The public rightly expect us to put an end to the annual winter crisis, and that's what we'll deliver, and I commend this statement to the House.
The Shadow Secretary of State, Ed Arger.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Minister for early sight of her statement. As I've said before, typically courteous of her, so I'm grateful for that. And I would echo the gratitude she expressed to those in our NHS, but also those in the social care workforce who will be working hard throughout the festive period. Now, as she's alluded to, the NHS is already feeling the pressure this winter. We know that winter is always tough for the NHS, irrespective of who is in government, but services are feeling the strain even earlier than in previous years. A tidal wave of flu infections has led to a 70% increase in hospital cases in just 7 days, and the National Medical Director of the NHS has warned of a quademic of health emergencies as cases of COVID, norovirus, RSV and the winter flu are all on the rise. Meanwhile, in October, the longest A&E waits of over 12 hours increased by over a quarter in just 1 month, reaching the third highest monthly figure since comparable records began in 2010. Now, all this, of course,